Author Donna J. Jodhan presents The Christmas Box Set Number 2. If you have not yet listened to Donna's 12 Days of Christmas Box Set Number 1, then you owe it to yourself to do so. This box set is made of 12 wonderful stories for the Christmas holiday season. They are all filled with mystery, suspense, and they all have happy endings. Now, Donna presents her second 12 Days of Christmas box set, 12 stories with wild imaginings. Donna paints pictures of hope, peace, and a bright future for the world. She develops amazing stories that will warm and thrill the hearts of the listener. Sit back now and enjoy Donna's 12 stories. You can email your thoughts and feedback to Donna at donnajodhan@gmail.com. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everyone.
Ho, 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 everybody, and it is author Donna Jodhan, also known as Detective DJ. Hope everybody is enjoying their holiday season. It's a wonderful, wonderful time of the year. And today I am pleased to share with you the 5th episode of my 12 Days of Christmas box set number 2. This one is titled The President's Christmas Ice Palace. I hope that everybody enjoys this particular episode. I would just like to mention the 4 previous episodes that I have shared with you, and here they are. The first one was Santa's Special Christmas Sleigh. The second was called The President's Christmas Packages. The third one was called Santa's Super Christmas Kids. The fourth was called Santa's Magic Marvels. So now we're on to story number 5. And here is a description. President Marco Sumner and his friend Nicholas Gleason has been given a very special mission this year. This being to create an ice palace filled with wondrous things for those who either do not have long to live or those who have received some very bad news. These have all been given bad news by their doctors, and now Marco and Nicholas want to help make their Christmas, this present Christmas, a memorable one. Find out how the president and his closest friend find ways to bring their guests to this special ice palace, despite receiving threats from some unknown folks. Christmas morning is the best, and everything ends in happiness and joy. So now it's on to our story. Part 1. Looking for something new. President Marco Sumner and his very close friend Nicholas Gleason are at a bit of loose ends as this year begins. Usually it is time when plans start to take shape for the following December's Christmas holiday celebrations. But for some odd reason, Marco and Nicholas seem to have a creative block. President Marco heads a huge international conglomerate, and this conglomerate manufactures, develops, and sells toys and games worldwide. His twin siblings Marty and Maya work alongside him, and his mom Kirsten is a very important member of this team. Marco and Nicholas met many years ago, and Nicholas wrote to Marco with a very special wish. Nicholas wanted Marco and his company to produce more toys and games for blind and vision-impaired kids like himself. His letter to Marco touched him and his mom, and soon Nicholas and his family were on their way from England to spend Christmas in America with Marco and his family. Nicholas's letter was especially appealing to Marco because not too long before he received Nicholas's letter, he almost lost his vision. But thanks to medical inventions and doctors who were determined to be successful, Marco managed to keep his vision. Marco and Nicholas had hit it off from the very beginning, and both families had bonded very quickly. Marco listened to Nicholas's dreams for blind girls and boys, to be able to enjoy more toys and games, not only at Christmas, but all year round. Marco became not just Nicholas's friend, but also his mentor. And it did not take too long for Nicholas and his family to move to the United States to live close to the Sumners. Marco and Nicholas's friendship grew to be something so very special and important. And it was so special and important to them both. And in time, Marco married Chelsea, and they named their first son Little Nick. And then 2 years later, twins were born to Marco and Chelsea, and they named their twins Scotty and Shay. And then some years later, Nick married Jane. And very early in their marriage, they became parents to Kirsten's sister and her husband's toddlers, Kristen and Tristan, who lost their parents in a plane crash. Xenia and Ryan had died, leaving these two toddlers to Jane and Nick. Oh boy. Yeah. So, Marco and his family helped Nicholas and Jane to raise these toddlers. And then, when the toddlers were about 6 and 5 respectively, Jane gave birth to their first son and named him Little Marco. And a year after his birth, their precious little daughter, Alexa, was born. However, Alexa inherited her dad's eye condition and has had to face the typical challenges of a blind child. But this has not stopped her from being a healthy and thriving child, being fiercely protected by her siblings, as well as Little Nick, Scotty, and Shay. The Sumners and Gleasons have managed to carve out very productive lives. They presently live in a very secluded and secure corner of the world, in a very high-profile community called Bobbin Square, in a country where the government helps and assists them with their work. Many families who are less fortunate live at Bobbin Square. They are either parents and or kids with special needs, or those who live below the poverty line. Marco and Nicholas have worked extremely hard to make sure that all residents of Bobbin Square are taken care of and have enough to eat and drink and opportunities to enjoy life, and they have opportunities for socializing and living, and much, much more. The residents of Bobbin Square are all guests of Marco and Nicholas and their families. Bobbin Square is the envy of many from around the world, and it is also the admiration of many from around the world. And Marco and Nicholas have become beloved celebrities. But through all of this, they have managed to live humble and private lives. They got to know Santa and his family through mutual friends, and Santa has often hired them, these techie magicians, to build special devices for him and to keep his channels secure and safe. Marco and Nicholas have participated in several of Santa's secret Christmas missions and have often been called upon to do such things as protect Santa, beef up his security missions, and to even rescue Santa from time to time. Marco and Nicholas have also worked very closely with the Kris Kringle International Foundation and with Chris's friend Josh Reisman, who is a very high-profile investigative reporter. And the Kris Kringle Foundation has been around for over 25 years and has built a reputation for helping those in need from around the world. It is just after New Year's, and these two friends have decided to take a trip to a ski lodge to do some skiing, some snowshoeing, and some ski boarding, as Nicholas has always wanted to try something new. Marco takes his dogs Flair and Flambeau on the trip, but Nicholas leaves his cats Mustard and Mayo at home with his family. The two are only planning to be gone for a few days. They rise early each morning, they go skiing, rest for a bit, eat heartily, and in the afternoon they go snowshoeing and try out snowboarding. The evenings are left for light banter, sipping hot drinks, and they have also managed to catch up on some well-needed sleep and reading. You can say that these two buddies are a bit restless because they believe that they have tried so many things before, and now they are at a bit of a loss as to what next to do. As Marco has remarked to Nicholas, not so for those dogs Flair and Flambeau, who seem to be thoroughly enjoying themselves and getting into all kinds of mischief. The friends agree that their next mission needs to be one that presents them with more than just a challenge, and one that would continue to help others at the same time. On the final day of their little trip, Marco and Nicholas decide to go ice fishing, and they leave the lodge. The dogs accompany them, and they thoroughly enjoy their outing, and they even manage to catch a few small fishes. In the evening, they enjoy a sumptuous dinner before a log fire, along with some bottles of wine. And this is all prepared by some well-known chefs. And they agree that at the end of it all, upon their return, they will try to find a mission that would enable them to bring cheer and joy to some very special folks. They will consult Santa and their friends Chris and Josh. And this is how it is at this very moment. Part 2. An unexpected request. The friends return to their families much refreshed, but still not sure what is next for them. Their wives, Chelsea and Jane, notice their continued restlessness, but they are not sure how to help. And as Marco and Nicholas would later reflect, one phone call changed everything in a big hurry. The families had just sat down to their weekly Sunday dinner, where both families usually came together when the phone had started to ring. It was not coming through their private line, but rather through Nicholas's cell phone. Nicholas checked the number, and for a wee bit he had hesitated before he answered it. He listened for a few minutes, and after hanging up, he told the family that his friend Kris Kringle wanted him and Marco to come to his head office immediately. And this head office was located in Montreal, Canada, and Chris wanted to meet with them. Chris did not give too many details on the phone, but the two friends were quite pleased and game for a meeting and for a trip out of Bobbin Square. Besides, they always enjoyed traveling to Montreal, especially so for the nightlife as well as for the ambiance. Whenever they traveled to Montreal, which was probably not often enough, they always returned with lots of clothes for the wives and toys and games for their kids. But on this occasion, they decided to take Chelsea and Jane along for a treat. 2 days later, the two couples boarded Chris's private jet and they landed at Trudeau International Airport after a long 10-hour flight. Chris did not waste time getting down to business, and while Marco and Nicholas were at the meeting with Chris, Chelsea and Jane enjoyed lots of shopping in Montreal and even took time to sample some of the Quebecois cuisine. Both ladies were great chefs in their own right. Chris's office overlooked the city, and the view was absolutely breathtaking, both by day and by night. The meeting started with a lovely buffet breakfast, followed by introductions around the table. Then Chris laid out his request, and as Marco and Nicholas would later reflect to each other, this was certainly a bit different when it came to requests. Chris demanded a commitment for strict confidentiality. No one was to know about this except for those in the room, and their dearest friend, the beloved Santa, would be told if his services were needed. Chris told the small group that Santa had already had somewhat of an idea, but he preferred this to be a Chris Kringle and Friends initiative, so as to give others a chance to shine. In short, this initiative was born out of letters that Chris had previously received from persons from around the world asking for his assistance. Chris had asked his good friend Josh Reisman, who was a world-renowned high-profile reporter and investigator, to advise him and to provide guidance. The two men had spent several months the previous year putting this initiative together, and now they had come to Marco and Nicholas for their help. Marco and Nicholas were given 2 days to review and provide responses. In their initial evaluation, the initiative seemed very doable and did not seem to have too many risks, but it could become risky if unwanted attention were to fall on it, and then it could become unmanageable, and it would probably end up having to be scrubbed. During the deliberations phase, Chris sequestered Marco and Nicholas at his private suite atop his head office in Montreal, along with Josh. Jane and Chelsea, however, were allowed to roam the city of Montreal with Chris's escorts and to rejoin their husbands at the end of the deliberation. Marco and Nicholas were allowed to take notes and to take them away with them when they left Chris's head offices, while the wives went home loaded with all kinds of goodies for the kids, for themselves, and some stuff for their husbands. And of course, there was lots of goodies for the folks at Bobbin Square. During the next few months, several Zoom meetings were held between Chris and Josh and Marco and Nicholas. And soon the initiative had started to take shape, and it was dubbed Operation Ice Palace. And everyone's dearest friend Santa was brought up to date when the details of the initiative had been completed. Top secrecy continued to be the main focus because everyone knew that there were bad guys lurking out there, just waiting to pounce and to do anything and everything that had anything and everything that was associated with Christmas. And this is how it was at this present time. Part 3. A child's precious wish. It was the news that no family had ever wanted to receive, especially so when it affected the future of their child. And this was exactly the news that the Mercado family in Brazil had received early last year. Their 8-year-old son, Stefano, had been diagnosed with an aggressive eye disease, and doctors had told the family that Stefano would lose his vision within 2 years. The family had been absolutely devastated and had written to the Kris Kringle Foundation asking for help for their little boy. Kris Kringle had taken a personal interest in this special request because of his friendship with Marco and Nicholas. Marco having had serious eye issues in the past, and Nicholas and his daughter's vision impairments. Kris had contacted Stefano's parents to learn more about the little boy's eye condition, and after several phone calls, he had arranged to bring Stefano and his parents to Montreal so that doctors could examine Stefano. The prognosis was not very good and had only confirmed the previous diagnosis, but doctors in Montreal had decided to keep Stefano for a week longer so that they could carry out other tests on him, as they were not sure if his sight was going to be the only thing that would be affected. The news coming back was even more heartbreaking, as doctors told the family that Stefano could also lose his hearing, and Kris was informed. The family was completely heartbroken, and with the consent of Stefano's parents, Kris had visited Stefano in the hospital and had had a nice long chat with the frightened little boy. Kris made several visits to see Stefano after this, and soon a bond had developed between the two. Kris had also spent a lot of time with the very grateful parents, and after a few weeks he had presented them with a very different type of idea. Stefano had confided to Kris that he had badly wanted 2 very special wishes to come true before he went completely blind. First, he had wanted to visit Disney World with his parents, but he knew that his parents could not afford to take him. Stefano had 4 other siblings who would definitely want to come along. And then he had wanted to meet his soccer hero, the great Pele, but he knew that Pele himself was not in good health, and that it would be practically impossible to make this come true. Stefano did not tell his parents about his wishes because he felt that they could not make them come true. And besides, they could never afford to do this for him. Stefano knew how heartbroken his parents already were, and he also knew how hard they had to work to provide for him and his 4 siblings. His 2 older brothers had to leave school in order to help their dad earn money, and his 2 younger sisters often went without a proper breakfast because the family could not afford to provide this. Kris would later reflect how wise Stefano was for his age and how thoughtful he was. And this truly endeared him to the little boy, and he vowed to himself that he would do all that he could to make Stefano's wishes come true. Stefano's parents were completely taken off guard and surprised when Kris presented him with his idea just before they left Montreal for home. At first, they totally refused, But Chris had used his gentle persuasion to convince the parents that Kris Kringle International Foundation had sent the Mercado family on a week-long visit to Disney World at Orlando, and they had stayed at a 5-star hotel, all expenses paid. Stefano could not believe his good fortune, and he and his parents had kept thanking Chris for having made Stefano's wish come true. And while the family was at Disney World, Chris and Josh had managed to contact Pele's public relations team, and they had readily agreed for Stefano to meet the great soccer star. Stefano and his parents were simply awestruck, and the other siblings also got to meet the great Pele. And at the end of the visit, Pele had given soccer balls to the dad and boys, and Pele dolls to the little girls and to the mom. Chris would have one more surprise for the Mercado family, which would come later. And this is how it was at this moment in time. Part 4, a hope and a prayer. And this was the gist of the story that had touched Chris when he read this particular letter. The letter had come from a young man named Sasha, living in Hungary. In his letter to the Kris Kringle International Foundation, he said that despite being in his late teens, he said that if he were to make a wish and really believed that it would come true, then it would. Sasha's story was one of heart-wrenching details. He had lost his dad to an airplane crash early the previous year, and then his mom had died of cancer not too long after he had lost his dad, leaving him to care for his younger sister Nikki. Sasha and Nikki had been left all alone in the world, with no family to help. Sasha was desperate and afraid, and his little sister had clung to him for her dear, dear life. But he had done his best not to let his little sister to see how afraid he too was. Sasha would often find his little sister Nikki sobbing in a corner of their small 2-rooms home, and he would often awaken at night to find her crying in the dark. He did his best to comfort her, often singing her back to sleep and rocking her gently in his arms in their old favorite rocking chair, which was their mom's favorite place to be whenever she felt scared and anxious. Sasha had done everything he could for Nikki to keep her warm, comfortable, and not wanting for food. But he was not much more than a child himself, and his meager wages as a cashier at a nearby supermarket was barely enough to keep them comfortable and to feed them. Sasha never went out to play with his friends because he did not want to leave Nikki alone. Neighbors had tried to help, but it was not enough to help Nikki to get over the loss of her parents. Sasha had made sure that Nikki attended school as much as possible, and the teachers had been very kind and supportive, and they had kept telling Sasha that despite being a bright little girl, the 7-year-old Nikki needed more help than they could give. It was just too much for Sasha to be both mom and dad to little Nikki, and now he had decided to write a letter to the Kris Kringle International Foundation asking for some sort of help, because Nikki's teachers had suggested this to him. All that he wanted was someone to take he and Nikki out of Hungary so that they could have a better life. In addition, just before writing his letter, Sasha received 2 bits of very bad news. First, he had received a letter from the Hungarian military recruiters informing him that he was required to report to the nearest military base within the next 6 weeks for military training, following which he would be sent to perform military duties in the far south of Hungary, and chances were that he would be gone for the next 3 years. Sasha had sobbed quietly after reading this letter. What was he supposed to do? There was no way that he would ever leave Nikki with anyone else. He was the only one that she had left in this world, but he knew only too well that failure to report for training would mean certain prosecution for him. Next, he received a call from Nikki's doctor the day after receiving his letter, telling him that Nikki needed to be seen immediately because the doctor had found a lump in her stomach and that the prognosis was not very good. Previous to the phone call from the doctor, Sasha had taken Nikki to the town's clinic because she had been complaining of stomach pain. Nikki had been examined and sent for tests, and now came the phone call to Sasha. Sasha had spent that night in very deep prayer and thought. He had made Nikki a dinner of cabbage soup and crusty bread, and after putting her to bed, he went outside in the fresh, cool spring air to think, pray, and hope. He sat outside on a bench, outside of his front door, and opening his mom's precious Bible, he had begun to read and pray. He is not sure how long he had sat there, but when he had noticed that the sun had already set, he had re-entered their little home and had gone to bed, making sure that before he had done so, his little sister was warm and comfortable. Sasha had risen early the next morning, and before taking Nikki to the clinic, he had written his letter to the Chris Kringle International Foundation, having been told by Nikki's teachers that it would not hurt for him to write to the foundation. And to his utter surprise, he received a call shortly after mailing his letter. Chris Kringle had called the stunned team and had spoken to him. At first, Sasha was very hesitant to say very much on the phone, but as the call progressed, Chris had managed to convince Sasha that he had really wanted to help. 2 weeks after this call, Chris's friend Josh Reisman had arrived in the little town where Sasha and Nikki lived. Josh did not waste time in speaking to the military authorities and to Nikki's doctor, and after a lot of talking and discussing amongst everyone, Josh had managed to arrange for Sasha and Nikki to return with him to the United States. Arrangements had been made for Nikki to enter hospital for tests and examination, and for Sasha to stay with her. And naturally, these 2 kids had clung to each other for support, as they did not really know how to react. Chris and Josh had taken turns visiting the kids every day, and at night Sasha would sit and read to his little sister, and they would talk to each other until Nikki had fallen asleep, and then Sasha would settle down in the adjoining room, and there he would open his mom's beloved Bible and proceed to read and pray. The Chris Kringle International Foundation had flooded Nikki's room with lots of toys and pretty clothes for her. and the child simply could not believe her eyes when she saw it all. Sasha had also received an iPhone, an iPad, and a laptop, and lots of clothes and books to read. Weeks had gone by before doctors had told Sasha that Nikki was now out of the woods, and Sasha had thanked God for this, and did not forget to thank Chris and Josh as well. And after having been released from the hospital, Chris took the kids to meet the family that had so readily agreed to give them a home. This was a family with 2 large retriever dogs, and Mr. and Mrs. Kaczynski were there to greet Sasha and Nikki when they drove up to the Kaczynski home that morning. Sasha had previously met the Kaczynskis and had taken an immediate liking to them. He had told Chris that he felt very sure that his little sister would also like them, and he was right. Bonding between the Kaczynskis and Nikki was instant, and what made this even easier was that the Kaczynskis were also of Hungarian parentage. Chris had one more surprise for Sasha and Nikki, but this would come later, and this is how it was at this present moment. Part 5. The most difficult choice. The story written in this letter really touched Chris, as he too had lost his own granny when he was a child, and he could really empathize with this granny's story. The little granny had lived in a little run-down house in the backwoods of Virginia, and for the past year she had been caring for her 2 pre-teen grandkids. Their mom had been killed in a robbery at her workplace, and the dad had deserted the kids shortly after losing his wife. Granny Heather was now the sole provider to her granddaughters, Kate and Anna, and she herself was not in very good health, and she had recently been told by her village physician that she did not have long to live. Granny Heather had a lung disease, which was making it more and more difficult for her to carry out her daily activities. On the one hand, she did not want to give up her precious Kate and Anna, but on the other hand, she knew that she would have to much sooner than later. Her neighbors were willing to help Granny Heather and the little girls, but there was only so much that they could do. Granny Heather's health continued to decline, and one day she could not get out of bed. Kate and Anna had found her gasping for air, and they had gone running to the neighbors for help. Granny Heather was taken to the hospital, where the doctors had told neighbors that she did not have long to live, probably just a matter of just a few more days. And Granny's last words to her friends, who surrounded her bed just before she slipped into unconsciousness, just look after my Kate and my Anna. Make sure that they are not separated and that they stay together. Granny Heather passed on that night, and now the neighbors were faced with a very, very difficult choice. Either to try and pull together to look after the little girls, or to find a family who would take them both. The neighbors had quickly decided that if they could not find a family to take both girls, they would do their best to provide for Kate and Anna. One thing was for sure: the friends and neighbors would do everything that they could to keep the 2 girls together. But they knew only too well that this was going to be a very tall task. Kate and Anna were taken to the hospital to say goodbye to their granny just before she had slipped into unconsciousness. and she had managed to smile at them both as they each took one of her hands just before she became unconscious. Kate and Anna were there when Granny Anna had breathed her last breath. Then they had rushed into each other's arms and had begun to sob uncontrollably. And as they hugged each other, Granny's friends and neighbors had closed in and had taken the little girls away. Granny Heather was buried a few days later, and a few friends had gathered after the funeral to talk amongst themselves. Granny Heather had had many friends in the neighborhood and had been well liked by everyone. She was kind, generous, and always had a smile on her face. Despite her illness, Granny Heather was hard-working and had protected her granddaughters like a lioness protecting her young. She had done everything for them, and in turn they had loved her with all of their hearts, obedient, helpful, and thoughtful to their precious Granny Heather. As the friends had sat around talking amongst themselves softly after the funeral, they knew that at the end of the day, the choice for Kate and Anna was very limited. Chances of keeping the two girls together were very slim. So they would have to be separated in order for them to be placed in different homes. This was not going to be very good for the girls. And now, what to do? Someone had come up with an idea, but they were not sure that it would even work. And a few weeks later, Mrs. Dubois, one of Granny's friends, who had received a phone call. She had written to the Kris Kringle International Foundation, and she was not sure if they would answer her pleas for help. Because of them being international, but it was worth a try. And on a late winter's morning, Kris and Josh had driven up in front of Mrs. Dubois' tiny house, where she and a few friends were waiting. But Kris and Josh had an idea as to what they were going to do. And as they had alighted from the large blue Mercedes SUV, Mrs. Dubois and her friends had watched as the two friends had walked briskly up the tiny sidewalk. Kris had stopped to pick a flower that was just beginning to bloom. Despite the still cool weather, he rang the doorbell and Mrs. Dubois had answered it. Kris had presented the surprised lady with the flower, and after he and Josh had been invited in, everyone had sat around Mrs. Dubois' dining room table. Kris and Josh had listened as Mrs. Dubois had told the story, and at the end she had told the two men that it had been Granny Heather's wish that Kate and Anna be kept together, but that it was going to be impossible because most families here could not afford to take both little girls at the same time. So the choice was going to be a very difficult one. After telling the story, Mrs. Dubois folded her arms and sat back. I was satisfied that she had told it to the best of her ability, and her friends had agreed with her. And then Mrs. Dubois and her friends had watched as Kris and Josh had nodded and exchanged glances. Then they had smiled at each other and at the group. They told Mrs. Dubois and their friends that they knew of a very loving family who were willing to adopt Kate and Anna. Josh had exited the home and had returned a few minutes later with Mr. and Mrs. Gareth Bradley, who had been waiting outside in the car. The Bradleys did not have any kids of their own, and they had desperately wanted to adopt kids, and this would be a perfect opportunity. Besides, they had a wonderful home to offer to Kate and Anna, and after introductions were made and questions answered, Mr. and Mrs. Bradley had waited with everyone else for the little girls to come home from school. Mrs. Dubois and friends made very sure that Kate and Anna would be happy going off with the Bradleys, and a few days later she and her husband accompanied Kate and Anna to their new home, a beautiful mansion in a city not far from their original home. Mrs. Dubois and her husband had stayed for a few weeks with the little girls in their new home, and on a pleasant morning they had said their goodbyes to the little girls and had departed. A tearful Mrs. Dubois had been satisfied that the little girls were going to be well taken care of, and as she got in beside her husband in their car, she made the sign of the cross and prayed that Granny Heather would be pleased with she and her husband for having agreed to leave Kate and Anna with the Bradleys. The little girls were going to be well taken care of. They would never forget their beloved Granny Heather, and the Bradleys had pledged to never ever let them forget their beloved Granny Heather. And Chris had had one more surprise for them, but this would come later. And this is how it was at this present moment. Part 6. A Child's Bedside Wish. Chris had been drawn to this particular letter because of a desperate mom's last wish, that her budding son's wish come true. He was a budding concert pianist. Chris himself was a concert pianist in his own right, and had always wanted to mentor someone to be just like him, and he had seen this as a perfect opportunity to make this come true. The mother lived in Taiwan, and even if she had been able to leave her homeland, she could not do so, because she had 2 other boys to look after, and she would not leave them behind. So she had written a letter to the Kris Kringle International Foundation, asking them to help her eldest son, Shan, to fulfill his dream. She gave further details in her letter, and after mailing it, she had said a silent prayer that it would be read, and her prayer was answered. In her letter, Shan's mum had told the Kris Kringle International Foundation that she had 3 boys. Shan was the eldest, and he was a promising concert pianist. She had wanted Shan to move to the United States so that he could fulfill his dream. However, she could not go with him because she had 2 other boys, the youngest who was sick and dying of leukemia. He had told Shan's mum and his 2 other siblings from his sick bed, and he had told them that his dying wish would be for Shan to become a concert pianist, and that he had wanted his mom to go with Shan to the United States. Shan's mom was very resolute. She would not leave the side of her dying son, and that she would do everything possible, too, for Shan to get to America. Her husband and father of the boys had been killed in a car crash shortly after her youngest son had become ill. Chris had read the letter about a month after it had landed on his desk, and he had read it a second time and had decided to consult with his advisors. His heart was very heavy, and he had wanted to do something for this family. But what? First, he sent his scouts to Taiwan to to investigate Shan's mom's story. And the scouts had had some difficulty locating the little town where Shan's mom and her boys lived. But after much persistence and diligence, they had located Shan and his mom and Shan's brothers. At first, Shan's mom had been very hesitant to share anything with the scouts. But when they reassured her that they were from the Kris Kringle International Foundation, she had broken down and had started to cry. She had invited them into her home, and Shan had been asked to give a recital. The scouts had been greatly impressed by the young boy's piano playing, and a few days later, Chris and Josh were on their way to Taiwan. To make further arrangements, Shan's youngest brother had died shortly after Chris and Josh had arrived. But he had died knowing that Shan's dream would be realized. About a month after their arrival, Chris and Josh had left Taiwan, bringing with them Shan, his mom, and his surviving brother back to the United States. Shan had been enrolled in a top music school, and his mom and brother were given a small home close by. The brother had been enrolled in a grade school, and Shan's mom was employed at a nearby Kris Kringle office. Chris knew that the family would eventually be happy, but first they had to overcome the loss of the youngest sibling. So in the coming months, he and Josh had done everything that they could to help the family adjust. Chris had one more surprise for this family, but it would come later on. The family was eternally grateful to Chris and had never stopped thanking him. And this is how it was this present moment. And now it's on to part 7. And these were the stories that Chris had used to craft his present initiative. He desperately wanted to do something very special for these particular families. That is something more than what he had already done for them, and for families in similar situations. But what could it be? Chris and Josh huddled together and brought in some very special personnel. They worked for a few months on ideas and plans, and finally they came up with something very special. But they knew that in order to carry this out, they needed to engage the help of Marco and Nicholas, and maybe even his dearest friend, Santa. So, Marco and Nicholas were brought into the picture, and as related in parts 1 and 2, they agreed to sign on. Santa was also consulted, but only agreed to assist if needed. Santa was very busy with his own initiatives and still not in the pink of health. After having had several health setbacks recently, Chris and his associates dubbed their mission as Operation Ice Palace. They presented Marco and Nicholas with a complete package of plans, and now it was up to the two mighty magicians, as they were often referred to do the rest and make it happen. The biggest decision was where to locate the Ice Palace: on the ocean closest to Chris's seaside mansion, or in the mountains closest to Bobbin Square, or even at the edge of the North Pole. If the location were to be closest to Chris's seaside mansion, It could afford the greatest privacy, but it could also pose some problems if it needed to be reached in a hurry because of the location. But the team had developed a workaround. If it were to be located closest to Bobbin Square, it would be easy for Marco and Nicholas to monitor it. But there could be a problem with privacy because of Bobbin Square's proximity, and if it were to be located on the edge of the North Pole, Santa and his team could keep tabs on it. But then again, Santa was already very busy with his own affairs, and his security team would probably be stretched a bit too thin. Yet Santa had suggested a workaround, so the decision had to be made. Where was the Ice Palace going to be located? The location had to be one where those families whose letters Chris had responded to could get to relatively easily and without being discovered, along with other families chosen by Chris's team. They were watchers out there, just waiting to pounce and do whatever it took to spoil any type of mission or project or anything that had anything to do with Christmas. And after several top-secret virtual meetings, it was Santa who had ended up choosing the location. Now it was time to start the real preparations and to get down to the business at hand. And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 8. Someone gets wind. Craftsmen, technicians, and other necessary staff were chosen very carefully by Chris and his team. The design of the Ice Palace was quickly developed, and the furniture was also quickly manufactured. It was prepared for transport. Chris had a wealth of personnel to choose from. Santa provided assistance through his very special team: reindeer, dolphins, lambs, and snowbirds. Marco and Nicholas took care of the technicians and worked on all of the security lines and everything and anything pertaining to security. They developed or established all the strategies for the security lines. But, as they say, nothing is ever foolproof at all. For the most part, it is not. And this is what happened one evening while some of Chris's team was at a bar enjoying drinks. They did not see as a newcomer had entered and had taken his place at the end of the bar. The newcomer had ordered a drink and then had proceeded to look around, chatting away with some of Chris's men, and learned that they were working on a very special and top-secret project. At first, the stranger did not think very much about this, but when one of the men told him that their boss was Kris Kringle, it was enough for the stranger to excuse himself and hurry out to his car. He knew who Kris Kringle was, and he thought that if he could get one of the local newspapers to delve into this story, he could make something out of this for himself. For after all, anything related to the name Kris Kringle was almost always great news. The newcomer was bang on. He was a news reporter and knew how to sniff out news stories. He drove quickly to the offices of the newspapers, and there he told his story. Soon, a fellow reporter was on the scene at the bar and had begun to question Chris's men. At first, he was unable to get very much out of the men, as they had all clammed up and had started to leave the bar. But the reporter was dogged and determined, and decided to follow the men as they had left. He had managed to convince his editor to send some additional cub reporters, and soon they had arrived and were following the men as they were going in all different directions. Unfortunately, however, they did not get the location of the Ice Palace, but they had gotten enough facts to print a story a day later. And of course, this story was sensationalized, and soon it gained legs. And a few days after the bar incident, the story had managed to find its way to some very major sources, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and even CNN and CBS had picked it up. Several talk shows had started to hunt down Chris Kringle for interview, and Good Morning America had almost caught him. But Chris had managed to slip across the border into Canada, and there he waited for things to cool down. And they did cool down after a few days, as Chris had managed to craft a nifty release, simply stating that he knew nothing about the story and that he was presently engaged in other business in Canada. As he would later reflect to Santa and others close to him, that was too close for comfort. And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 9. Coming Together. Chris and his team had come up with a very unique idea. This being, before the letter writing, families were supposed to receive their surprises. They would be introduced in order to promote some sort of bonding, and this would be done based on what the team thought would be good fits and matches, and it turned out to be a great success. The Mercado family was matched with Kate and Anna and their new parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bradley, because Chris felt that the Mercado siblings would be good playmates for Kate and Anna, and that the two sets of parents would get along just fine. And everyone did. What is even more gratifying is that Kate and Anna bonded so very well with Stefano of the Mercado family, and practically became his eyes and ears as he continued to lose his sight and hearing. The two families had spent the summer, or part of the summer, in each other's company, and then again for Thanksgiving. But no one had expected or suspected what would come next for them. In the case of Sasha and his little sister Nikki, they were paired with Shan and his mom and his younger brother. And Shan's mom soon took Nikki under her wing, treating her like the daughter that she had always wanted, while Sasha acted like a big brother to Shan and his younger brother. The Kaczynskis also fitted in quite nicely, and Shan enjoyed playing the piano with Mrs. Kaczynski, and together they spent much time at the piano, playing duets and even composing. Mr. Kaczynski even enjoyed spending time with Sasha and Shan's younger brother. He spent a lot of time with Shan and Shan's younger brother, and he often took the boys on fishing trips and hikes. So, Shan would join the boys whenever he could, and Nicky was thoroughly spoilt by everybody, most of all by Shan's mom and Mrs. Kaczynski. These two families also spent part of the summer with each other, and again at Thanksgiving, but no one knew what was to come next. Chris would later reflect to others how much joy he felt in seeing these families get along so well together. And after Thanksgiving, it was time to get ready for the final stage of Operation Ice Palace. And in preparation for the final stage, the Kris Kringle International Foundation had also sent out special invitations to those families who had written with similar stories. And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 10, Secret Journeys. And after Marco and Nicholas had started to receive some unveiled threats from some unknown persons, suspects being the three wise men, but no one was very sure, it was decided that the chosen families would be sent on secret journeys in order to get to their secret destination. The families were only told that they would be going on a secret journey to a Christmas wonderland, somewhere that they had never been to before. And the kids had naturally begun to dream and imagine, while the parents were only given the minimum information so as not to accidentally disclose anything to the kids. So, the secret journeys began a week before Christmas Eve, and by then had already been built to a crescendo. The travelers had been warned that utmost secrecy had to be the order of the day, and Chris's chosen families were prepared for travel. And here is where Santa came into the picture. One of his nondescript planes picked up the Mercado family and flew them to a private runway. Another of Santa's nondescript planes did the same for Kate and Anna and Mr. and Mrs. Bradley. The two families were surprised to see each other, but there was no time to waste. On the runway was one of Santa's special sea sleighs, and both families boarded this sleigh. The special sea sleigh took off quickly and quietly, and then headed for the seacoast. The same thing happened for Sasha and Nicky and the Kaczynskis, and for Shan and his mom and younger brother, and both families had boarded another of Santa's special sea sleighs, and this too had headed for the seacoast. Similar nondescript planes had taken off with other chosen families and had flown them to private runways where the special sea sleighs were waiting. The families boarded and the special sea sleighs headed for the sea coast. As most of the guests would later reflect, no one expected to experience what came next. And Santa's drivers were in charge. Teams of reindeer drove the sleighs over calm seas for the most part, and as the families sat back and watched, they saw groups of dolphins dressed in Santa uniforms, egging them on as they flew over the warm waters. The dolphins danced, waved, and saluted as they flew over the water. Sequin and CJ took charge of this segment, And then, as the sleighs moved over colder waters, the snowbirds, headed by Snowcone and Snowflake, took over. The snowbirds greeted the sleighs with salutes and fly passes over the sleighs, and everyone grew more and more excited. The kids especially loved it all, and some of them had to be restrained at times by Santa's elves and helpers. All in all, each sleigh had traveled for about 5 hours from the seacoast to their destination. So there was lots of entertainment aboard the sleighs, as Santa's helpers and elves provided games, books, and iDevices for the travelers. There was also a lot of food and Christmas music aboard the sleighs. And those lucky sleigh riders were also treated to a star show, whereby the stars had done their star dances as the sleighs flew by, and saluted the sleighs and nodded to them in greeting. And this is how it was at this very moment in time. Part 11. The Unimaginable Ice Palace. And as they traveled over the seas, the families saw lots of other things. There were ships of all sizes sailing along, and the captains blew their horns in greeting as the sleighs sped along and raised their sails. And sailors had stood on the decks of the ship and had applauded, waved, and saluted the sleighs as they went on their way. Many of the smaller boats saluted with their powerful flashlights, and the sleighs had acknowledged them in turn. Then there were schools of all kinds of fishes, little fishes and big fishes, all sizes and all colors, and turtles and sharks and whales all greeted the sleighs as they flew by. And Santa's elves and helpers passed out food to the kids so that they could drop it for the turtles and fishes. And the sleighs had dropped down to within just a few feet of the fishes so that the kids could feed them. What a treat for the kids as the turtles and sharks and fishes came close to the kids, and the whales came close too. And elves and helpers had taken photos of the kids as they had handed out the fish food. Then, as the sleighs had entered colder water, the families had begun to see penguins and seals on ice floe, and they too greeted the sleighs as they flew overhead. Then there was a treat for the sleigh riders as the sleighs had begun to drift toward land. Yes, bears and wolves, standing on huge ice islands and looking skywards. They all saluted, and the sleighs saluted back. The sleigh riders simply could not believe their eyes. Then unexpectedly, there it was, right before everyone's eyes, one of the most magnificent sights to behold. A majestic floating ice palace off the coast and close to Chris's mansion. And as the sea sleighs got closer to the palace, the family saw Chris, Josh, and other persons standing on the roof of the ice palace waving them in. And then the sleighs had touched down, and before you knew it, Kate and Anna had dragged Stefano along with them down the steps of the sleigh, running together to greet Chris and Josh, who hugged all three kids. All the while, the two little girls had kept describing everything to an overwhelmed Stefano, because he was no longer able to see clearly because of his failing vision. And now the little girls had become his eyes and ears. There it was, standing majestically in the twilight of the evening. So much to see and to take in all at once. Tall ice towers with colorful crystals cascading down their sides. Christmas trees everywhere, constructed from ice, and Christmas lights blinking away. And the Christmas trees were decorated with ornaments made from ice. Huge ice sculptures with Santa hats on their heads, some with beards just like Santa, and others dressed like Mrs. Claus. And then there were those dressed like Santa, but holding bags of toys and gifts. Then everyone was simply swept off their feet by the many ice castles, houses, churches, and gingerbread houses, and cottages, all made out of ice. Then those beautiful ice rinks and many sleds and sleighs waiting to take persons up and down the mountain. The interior of the ice palace was even more magnificent. Everything was made out of ice, but there were warmers around to keep everyone warm, and coolers to keep the ice frozen. The sleeping quarters were even more elaborate. Bunk beds made of ice for the kids, heated with special mattresses. Luxurious beds for the parents, and then the restaurants and dining rooms, undescribable, with their seats and tables made out of ice and covered with heated cushions. The chosen families had spent the next week in total bliss, and there were so many unbelievable eye-openers for them to experience. There were even ice pianos, believe it or not, for Shan and Mrs. Kaczynski to play. And for the next week, this ice palace had played host to these very grateful families. Chris, Josh, along with Santa's helpers and elves, acted as hosts. Then Christmas Eve had arrived, and this is how it was at this very moment. Part 12. A Christmas morning to remember for all times. The ice palace rocked with Christmas activities on Christmas Eve. Lots of activities for the kids, concerts and shows, and the reindeer entertaining with their singing, dancing, and air displays. They showed off their skills, and then it was time for the parties to end, and for everyone to retire to their beds. No one really knew what to expect on Christmas morning, except that it was going to be very special. And special it was. The ice palace was suddenly jolted out of bed by Chris's voice coming through on the intercom. It was almost 7 a.m. and everyone had an hour to get out of bed and then get ready for a little trip. And bang on time, there was another sound. The sound of helicopters hovering overhead, and Chris asking everyone to please assemble outside as quickly as possible. No one asked any questions and did as they had been told. Many buses waited, and the families boarded, and they were taken through a tunnel lit by lanterns that were made of ice. The trip had taken no more than 5 minutes, and the buses had stopped at the exits. And then the families had disembarked, and there they were. Santa Claus waving and shouting, "Ho, ho, ho!" And there was Mrs. Claus as well, waving and shouting, And then there was Rudolph and his fellow reindeer. Everyone had gone absolutely wild. The sound of the helicopters were those of Santa's Santacopters, bringing Santa and Mrs. Claus and Rudolph and his reindeer for a Christmas morning visit. No one would ever forget that day, especially for the presents that they had received from Santa and Mrs. Claus and Marco and Nicholas. The kids had been asked to submit their wish lists a few days before, and they were all granted. For Stefano, a harp and a guitar from Santa and Mrs. Claus, and special braille devices from Marco and Nicholas. He was also invited to visit Marco and Nicholas next summer. For his siblings, bicycles and mini motorcycles from Santa and Mrs. Claus, and dolls and doll houses for the girls, and soccer balls and basketballs for the boy. From Marco and Nicholas, the Mercado parents also received lots of gifts. For Sasha, from Santa and Mrs. Claus, a model train set and a model airplane kit, and lots of books and games from Marco and Nicholas. Nicky had received an adorable little puppy from Santa and Mrs. Claus, along with a complete dollhouse and dolls, and lots of clothes from Marco and Nicholas, along with a specially designed electronic tablet. Mr. and Mrs. Kaczynski had also received lots of presents. For Kate and Anna, they each received a fluffy little kitten from Santa and Mrs. Claus, along with complete doll houses and dolls. And Marco and Nicholas gave the girls lots of clothes and electronic tablets. Mr. and Mrs. Bradley also received presents. Finally, for Shan, his younger brother, and his mom, a baby grand piano and a Batman suit from Santa and Mrs. Claus, and clothes and a laptop from Marco and Nicholas. Shan's younger brother received a bicycle and a scooter from Santa and Mrs. Claus, and clothes and a laptop from Marco and Nicholas. Their mom had also received presents, and all of the other families who were invited had received similar presents from Santa and Mrs. Claus and from Marco and Nicholas. Chris and Josh had also given presents to everybody, and all was well on that Christmas morning. No one had seen when Santa and Mrs. Claus had departed, but he had invited everyone to visit him at the North Pole next Christmas before he departed. The end. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that everybody's having a great holiday time. This I enjoyed writing for you, the President's Christmas Ice Palace. I really enjoyed, being imaginative. And I wish everybody continued enjoyment, peace, love, and greet each other. You take care, and I will see you the next time. Ho, ho, ho!